Welcome. This is Deborah Osborne, a former crime analyst with the Buffalo Police Department and a retired investigative analyst from the U.S. Secret Service. And today I'm speaking with Christopher Bruce, who has over 16 years experience as a crime analyst and is now an assistant professor at Hudson University in Maine. And Christopher and I are going to talk about qualitative crime pattern analysis, a subject dear to our hearts. So Chris, would you like to begin?
Yeah, well, the idea for this topic came out of our discussions, I think, about what it is that modern crime analysts do with their time. I think that back when we were both working for municipal agencies, and we first met back in the 1990s, even though we didn't have the communications options available that everybody has today, I think there was more of a shared understanding about what a crime analyst day should look like back then. And it always began, for I think just about all of us, with taking the stack of reports. It was a physical stack back when I got started. It would be on the computer now, but taking all those reports that had come in since the last time we were there and reading them, going through each one of them, marking them up, uh, doing a little bit of coding, and most importantly, absorbing the context of uh, how crime occurred. And you worked for a larger agency than I did, Deborah, so you probably didn't have as much time to read all of them that I did. But I'm sure that you and I probably had a very similar process when it came to approaching that day-to-day report review. Um,
Can I just say, Chris, I did have all the crime reports on Lotus Notes, all the well, not even just part one crimes, there'd be prostitution, there'd be, criminal mischief. So I skimmed all the narratives every single day.
okay.
And we had, 20,000 crimes a year in Buffalo when I was in 1997 when I started, or 1998, which was my first full year. So
Mm-hmm.
I always, that's what I did every day, just like you did. I became familiar with
Okay.
what was happening right now.
So even in a city the size of Buffalo, you had time to look at them all. In fact, I remember a very early trip I took with a coworker, Rich Severi, back in the late 90s. We visited the Chicago Police Department. Of course, one of the largest agencies in the country. You think if anyone wouldn't have time to read the reports, they wouldn't. But their crime analysis unit, they didn't read everything, but the analysts assigned to robberies read every robbery report that was taken in Chicago the previous day. And they had burglary analysts doing all the burglary reports. So even in very large places, it's possible. And we'll talk about it as we get more into the weeds. But of course, there are ones that you can always just sort of skim, as you say, because they're not really connected to anything. They're clearly one-off incidents, and there's only probably maybe 20% that you've really got to focus any serious amount of attention on. So we talked about a lot of the reasons why it's important to do this, and I think the first thing we agreed on is that it's one of the most important qualitative processes that you can do as a crime analyst. The narrative is the one unstructured part of the report, and so the analysis of it is inherently a qualitative process. And a lot of analysts, they tend to focus on just quantitative data sets, things they can count, things they can do a number of mathematical operations with, but it's important to build that qualitative side as well. And that's an easy way to do it, is to get into those narratives every day and start identifying common themes among the narratives that you're reading.
Yes, and
Uh,
Chris, I just want to say too, and when you're reading narratives and you're skipping things, like, so it all depends on the quality of data collection in the field.
yeah.
So if your officers, so for me, stolen cars, they would just write TWOP, taken without permission, and there would be nothing like it was in the driveway, it was on the street, they left the keys in. So what you analyze will depend on the quality of the data, not just the quantitative data, because sometimes that's not collected correctly, but especially the qualitative data. And I would
Right.
like to say that police officers need to take time to collect better qualitative data. But meanwhile, there's always something in your crime reports, qualitative, that you will benefit from by reading the report.
Absolutely. Are you saying that was the entire narrative, TWOP?
Yes.
Oh, it's a riot. Usually I find the opposite is true, that the narrative is more fleshed out, and it often helps identify problems in the discrete data. So if for instance the officer didn't type in the earliest time that the incident could have occurred or the latest time the incident could have occurred in the proper fields for those things, you often find it in the narrative instead. And so reading the narrative, one of the benefits is it helps you check your data quality. But I just wanted to take a quick look at an example here. I've got a fictional narrative here. It's based on a real one, but it's a fictional jurisdiction. Uh, Cold Bay, Washington. That's where I set all my fictional crime. And this is a report of a burglary that happened at a residence there. Let me open up the whole thing here. This is visible, right, when I'm scrolling?
Yes.
Okay. Um, and so there's a lot of interesting stuff in these narratives that you'll never find in any set of discrete data fields. I know there's a lot of RMSs out there that really try hard to codify different modus operandi elements, the point of entry, the point of exit, the method of entry, and so forth. But I don't know about you. I've never seen one in which I could trust the officer's entries in those MO fields. But even if I could, there would be a lot of stuff that those fields just cannot capture. And so we have, for instance, a note here that the family was out at a movie when this burglary occurred. Now that's never anything that's ever, there's no checkbox in the records management system that says out at the movies or any field that you'd enter that value into. It's just, there's just too many potential variables for that sort of thing, and yet that could be vital to our understanding of a crime pattern. Right? If this happened 3 or 4 times where the family was out at a movie or temporarily away from the house, we might start to wonder, is the burglar learning about the vacancy from social media or through other types of sources? And you're just not going to get that if you don't study the qualitative data. There's more in here about um, the offender having ransacked the house a bit. And here we go. Have taken a pillowcase from the bed, presumably in order to help store his stolen loot. Again, an important MO element that I don't think you're ever going to see in any discrete data field. So the first benefit to reading these reports is it gives you some context about the crimes that have occurred that you're never going to get anywhere else. And this context might be important to piecing patterns together or to understanding the offender's behavior in a particular crime or in a crime pattern.
Yes, Chris. And also, I just want to say, is in your notes, as we prepared for this, we talked about the importance of just really understanding crime by reading all these. So if you're reading all these burglary reports, it takes time. You can't be working in a job for 1 month, even a whole year. You have to be doing it for a while to really understand the significance of what you're reading. And it's like a skill. So qualitative crime pattern analysis is a skill that can only be learned by reading crime reports. Correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, it gives you a sense of what's normal, right? And then of course, from that, you get a sense of what's abnormal. When I was very new, when I was reading the reports, my agency was Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. Everything was abnormal, and so I was gasping all the time. Oh my God, this happened, in this particular way. And a few weeks later, oh, another one of these. I learned very quickly what to expect, what was usual. And so when something unusual happened, such as a burglar, I don't know, ate some food out of the victim's refrigerator or used the bathroom or something while he was in the house, that jumped out right away. And yeah, you don't get that unless you're reviewing these reports regularly. Now, your title here was qualitative pattern analysis. So obviously, identification and analysis of patterns is a huge part of all of this. And I'm about to actually teach a tactical crime analysis course next week. So this is all fresh in my mind. And one of the first things I teach is how do you identify patterns in the first place? And there are ways to do it with databases, of course, and um, connecting data together and weighing different elements and so forth. But if you're reading the reports on a day-to-day basis, the first database you're consulting is your own memory. Right. So I've just read that burglary report in which a pillowcase was used and the family was at the movies. And next week, if I read another one that has either of those two elements, I'm probably going to remember the one that I just read. I might not remember it 6 months later or a year later, but if it's a short-term pattern, I'm definitely going to remember that. And I'm going to make that connection instantly without having to do any database searching. And again, how would you do a database search for those types of elements? That would be very hard to piece those two together in any type of quantitative way. So it really does enhance your ability to identify patterns and series in the first place if you're looking at the cases on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Um,
Chris, I
I,
like to say like machine learning, they say machine learning is because the machine goes over and over and learns different patterns. And that's the same thing with our brains. And it could be the opposite. Like when I was an analyst, and I started with robberies when I first started analyzing crime because I knew they would be more in series after I got a little training. And we had like 10 delivery truck robberies in 1 month. And I thought that might be normal. So it's almost the opposite, but I didn't know. I mean, I made a report and that was a series and it got solved, but you have to read reports to understand your job as a crime analyst at the local level of law enforcement.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, the one of the other benefits I wanted to highlight has to do with data and data cleaning and sort of a data management process. Not all analysts do this sort of thing, but this is one of those things that, again, when we were uh, both working for municipalities, I think it was sort of understood as part of our jobs to do a little data cleaning, do a little data supplementation as we went about the process of reviewing the reports day to day. It's not just about reading them; it's about extracting information from them and recording it in a retrievable way sometimes. So, for instance, let's say I did think that pillowcase MO was something that I wanted to keep track of for other burglaries. Well, probably I'm not going to convince my records management vendor to add a field for that. Maybe I have a system where I could add a value, but generally speaking, I'm not. And so what I probably want to do is maintain sort of my own data set off books just from analysis purposes that have at least those additional elements that I want to track. Now, we both know, we've both seen analysts that will go and retype the entire report into their own databases. You don't have to do that these days, especially, right? There are automated ways that you can extract the day and the time and the core RMS information from the report and not have to retype that yourself. But there are fields and data elements that analysts might want to track that simply will never be part of the official RMS. And one of those things is a summary of the narrative, just a quick 2 or 3 sentences in which the analyst writes only the most important facts about what happened. And then later on, when they're looking for patterns and searching their database, they don't have to read the whole narrative again. They just have to scan the summary that they wrote. I also think that writing those summaries helps sort of cement the incident in your mind a little bit better, and it makes it more likely that you're going to recall it a little bit later. I have a screenshot here of a the report on the screen is fictional, but this is a real database that's used by the Lowell Police Department in Massachusetts today to review their data as it comes in and add their own coding to it. So a lot of these data fields, the case number, the date and time, the location, the victim and suspect info, if there is any property info, all of that is pulled from the records management system. And a lot of it is good data, and the analyst never touches it. But the analyst ends up coding a lot of additional stuff. So as they go through the process of reading the report, they click this narrative button here and they get the officer's narrative. They review it, and then they type their own summary here. of the narrative. This one's a little bit long, but it's a complicated incident. It's a home invasion. So they type that, and then they have a number of check boxes here for different flags that help them produce later reports very quickly. And then they have some tabs here for different types of crime in which they record different MO elements that the records management system doesn't track. At the same time, they're verifying the report dates and times and the locations and the type of location, which are all fields in the records management system, but might be wrong. So they correct them in their own database if they are, because as we know, the process of getting it officially corrected in the real report might be something the analyst just doesn't have any control over. Now, this is a long process, no question. This might take them. There are 4 or 5 person crime analysis units serving a city of a little over 100,000 people. This might take them a couple of hours every day collectively to go through all of the reports and do this coding. But once it's done, in this database, they have this wealth of information. They can very easily produce address histories and person histories that have these summaries rather than, again, forcing either them or their audience to go through the entire report, all the reports again. They can quickly produce reports of all gun crimes, gang crimes, juvenile crimes that have happened, in a particular time period. And when it comes to doing analysis for their patterns or for long-term reports, they've got all these data fields that wouldn't otherwise exist that they can ask questions of. And I'm sorry, I've been going on for a while, but to illustrate the importance of that, I was working for a fairly large agency doing some contract work about 6 or 7 years ago. And I don't remember what the inciting incident was, but the media became very interested all of a sudden in sexual assaults, and particularly sexual assaults that occurred on a campus, I think, within that city. And what the media wanted to know is, of all the sexual assaults you're reporting here, how do they break down between, assaults between people who know each other versus stranger assaults on the same campus? And they might have had a few other questions as well. And what they had to do, the analysts ended up spending like 2 weeks frantically reading every single sexual assault report that had happened in the last 5 years, just so they could code those additional variables, such as whether it was an acquaintance rape or a date rape, or whether it happened at a party or something like that. Whereas if they'd been reading them day to day and coding them all along, they would have been able to answer that question immediately. It would have made their department look good to the media and to the public. It would have showed they were on top of the data. But I think because so many analysts are reluctant to spend that time these days, they end up having to spend a lot of time in an emergency that makes it worse, frankly.
And Chris, one of the things is, in the long run, you can save a lot of time. So when you're reading reports, so I'm not as technically savvy as most people, and I didn't have cooperative IT people, and we were just getting our.
Does anybody?
I don't know. I had one really good helper, but that didn't solve the whole problem. But so we were just getting an RMS system, and sometimes also reports weren't in there right away, or like you said, they're inaccurate. There's problems with consistency, but I could read every day my summary. And so when somebody wanted to know how many people were shot, well, we don't have a crime in New York State that's a person's shot specifically.
Right.
So we would have to be reading reports. And the same thing I developed, but it was until years. So I was a crime analyst for 10 years. So it was probably the last 3 years where I really realized if I collected the information, and I, not being, a programmer or real tech savvy, just used an Excel workbook, and I would have all sexual assaults with unknown assailants. And then I backfilled that over when I was bored, when I had downtime, or when I didn't, when I needed, I just made it my project. And I did that like with purse snatchings, taxi driver crime, delivery crime, so that I could also then summarize it when I had a series. Every time I added the new thing, I could look back and see if there was a connection. I didn't have to rely on my, not so always efficient mind, but I would be able to trigger, those kinds of things. And once we had a sexual crime series where someone was raped once in an elevator, once in a hallway. And if I wasn't reading the reports, and now, yes, the investigator should know this, but they work different shifts. They get assigned one crime. Like they don't all have this. They don't always talk. So your job as an analyst is to be the one who identifies things because you're assigned to it. Like somebody's responsible then. If no one is responsible to look for patterns in series, and let me just say too, patterns could be, yes, I think always in terms of crime series, a serial offender, but also when you're reading reports, you see trends. So when copper was starting to be stolen in Buffalo, a lot more because prices went up, I'd be like, what's going on here in the city? And so new crime trends, just like when iPhones came out, people started stealing them more. You start seeing what is the newest crime trend. And if you're not reading the reports, how would you know, right?
Right. No, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned copper because I remember that exact year when that started to spike, and you're right, from reading the reports that I suddenly started to see copper everywhere. That is not a field in the system. You have to get that from the narrative. iPhone is not or it wasn't at the time they started getting stolen. It wasn't a property type that you would put in that specific field. You had to read the narratives to see that was becoming a problem. Uh, the importance of doing that subcategorization uh, can be reflected in fairly quantitative processes. Reading the report and then deciding what category something falls in is a qualitative process, but it can benefit quantitative analysis later on. I think of the typical monthly crime report or quarterly crime report or ComStat report, where you've got a bunch of crime categories and whether they were up or down. And they drive me crazy because so many agencies feel like they have to stick for some reason to the same old 7 UCR categories that were developed back in 1922 and we've all been using since then. But what does it really tell you? That burglaries are up 20% or robberies are up 30%. If you've been coding them, you've been categorizing them, you can instantly tell your command staff that it's not robberies that are up 20%, but it's specifically street robberies involving juveniles or something like that, and that becomes a lot more important. And your example with shootings is a perfect example. A shooting isn't a crime category. A shooting could be a homicide, it could be a robbery, it could be an aggravated assault. But you can assemble a shooting from those specific fields if they're being accurately coded. And again, I've never seen an RMS that codes specifically that somebody got hit with a bullet. You'll see that it was a particular type of crime and maybe an injury level and maybe a gun is the weapon, but you can't always be sure. And so, yeah, that process of reading and report review and coding helps you assemble those categories like shootings, like heroin overdoses that wouldn't otherwise exist within the coding scheme that you have as an agency. Oh God, you said something else that was really important too, and I've lost the thread on it. But of course, the objection I always hear from analysts to this idea is that they don't have time. That it would take them all day to read all of their reports. And I don't know, what would you say to that, Debbie?
I would say, just while you were talking, I was thinking about the skill that they don't say analysts need is reading. Like
Yeah.
being able to read and comprehend quickly and decide what's important. And another thing I thought of as we were preparing for this is that a lot of times no one knows if you don't find the pattern, right?
All right, true.
So it's a lot of responsibility, so integrity. So what I'm saying too, I guess, is to have integrity as an analyst, you need to be able to really do your job, which requires that you understand the crime in your jurisdiction on a daily basis. So I moved to federal, level law enforcement analysis, and it wasn't as urgent. And there was a relaxed quality, not always, because with the Secret Service, I was also sometimes doing protective, urgent, and analytical work. But mostly I was working on big investigations that sometimes took years. Mm-hmm. So when you're a crime analyst, your job is to know the daily crime. I mean, depending on your assignment, like you said, in your notes for preparing that if you're not doing qualitative analysis, you're really an administrative analyst.
Right. Yeah.
Your job is to me, at the local level, especially those analysts who might most benefit from this presentation are the one-man shops in a smaller jurisdiction. You need to know, because they might not have all the technical support, they might not have the guidance, but you need to be reading your reports to have integrity, to really understand the crime in your jurisdiction. And one thing we haven't talked about is also reaching out to other jurisdictions to find out similar crimes. So maybe you might want to say something about that, Chris.
Well, yes. I mean, well, first of all, I want to echo what you said about those hidden patterns, because you're absolutely right. If there's 2 or 3 incidents that are related, and you as an analyst haven't identified it yet, probably nobody knows about it, unless it's some really high profile crime like a serial homicide or something. And so those can go on for a while before everybody becomes generally aware of it. And if you're an analyst and somebody has to tell you that a crime pattern exists instead of vice versa, I don't think you're really doing your job. You should be identifying those in the second or third incident. And really, this report review process is the surest way to do that. Um, and I've forgotten what you said at the end there that was important. Hold on.
Other jurisdictions, like how
Oh, right. Yes.
to other jurisdictions, and how for
Yeah.
me, I would use a lot of my material to share a newsletter weekly, because I was a one person in a 250,000 population city, almost 1,000 officers. I could only do so much, but I would share what I found all around the region. And so that helped. Other agencies would reach out to, like, our robbery squad. They had a similar robbery or rape or whatever, even the trends, but sharing that information, so then you get more information and you can flesh out that you actually have a pattern. And the reason we identify this is so that we can stop the criminal, right? I mean, I would like to prevent crime and problem solve and not have to arrest people because I'm that type of person, but I really don't want to be victimized by the same purse snatcher downtown when I'm walking on my lunch hour that's been doing it 5 times when somebody could have caught him after 2 times, actually, because you said, oh, he said the same thing, like, I'm sorry to have to do this, and he took my purse and ran away. I kind of know after 2 crime reports, like, oh, here's a polite robber who does the exact same thing. He's probably, it's probably the same person.
And it always surprises me there aren't more little scandals related to that, right? The police should have known about this sooner. They should have done something sooner. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are many crimes by their very nature tend to be cross-jurisdictional. Commercial robbery, fraud, a lot of commercial burglaries. It's very rare to find them all confined to one jurisdiction. And in Buffalo, you were in the urban center, so you probably had most of what was happening in the area. But there's a lot of people who might watch this that are working for sort of a patchworks of municipalities, all next to each other, none very large or smaller than the other, that really do have to work together if you're going to identify patterns. So what is the uh, equivalent of reading reports when it comes to other jurisdictions in your area? I suppose if they have analysts sharing the things that you do read. And again, those narrative summaries are a great way to do it, right? You could just print off a couple of pages of this is all the major crime we've had this week and send it around for people to scan. But short of that, because I don't know about you, but when I was working as an analyst, a lot of the cities around me didn't have analysts. And there wasn't even anybody I could call there that I knew for sure would know how to search their system in a way that they would get the answer to what I was looking for. So you have to back that up, I suppose, with any source that you can get, including open source, right? Police logs in the local newspaper or crime stories. I use Google Alerts for a lot of things just to alert me when things are happening in my surrounding area. If you have any kind of local law enforcement regional bulletin board or email list or data sharing system, getting tapped into those and reading those cases is going to be almost equally important to reading the reports in your own community.
Right. Now,
Um,
yeah, now we have crime. There were no crime analysts anywhere around me. So,
yeah,
but we do now
you've
have,
got regional centers in New York now.
now
What?
we do. And
Yeah,
that makes a big difference. And they communicate with each other because they're all
yeah,
under the same sort of umbrella. So that really
yeah,
improves public safety. And like you said, why aren't people more upset? Because they don't understand that when something's not done. And of course, that's what gives me still interest in advocating for the profession, because if information is there and if we just bring it together with the modern tools, including people who know how to process information to reduce the chance of people getting victimized. I mean, it's, to me, it's like a moral cause. I mean, you don't
no,
want.
I agree with you. And
Yeah,
if you're an analyst, any analyst has probably had the experience of they've done their job. They identified the pattern, they wrote up information about it, they put it out there, and then the agency didn't act on it, and then the next incident happened. I suppose that's a topic for a different day, but it really is depressing when that happens. It's tough to maintain a positive outlook as an analyst when your work uh, isn't used. But I wanted to get back to that objection about time, because I'm sure that's what everybody, half the people watching this are going to be thinking. Well, this sounds great, but I just don't have the time to get to it. And I think I would challenge that because you did it yourself at an agency of 1,000 officers, and that's a really high staffing ratio. Most formulas would say you should have had. I don't know, two, three, four other people working with you at the same time. And I had my Chicago example. New York uh, has an entire unit. New York City Police has an entire unit dedicated to pattern identification. And this unit of people does nothing but read reports. And then they log the patterns they identify into a central pattern database. It's a fascinating thing. So if you literally did not have the time to read reports, at least the most important reports, right? The most patternable crimes, I would say, then you're just understaffed, maybe significantly understaffed, and that's something that your agency needs to look at. But if you meet the most common staffing formulas, which the IACA recommends, I think one analyst for every 1,500 Part One crimes that the agency takes in a year. If you're around that ratio, then you probably have more time than you think. It doesn't take as long as you might think, as we've talked about. You learn a certain shorthand eventually, right? You know what to look for. You know what to um, where to focus your attention. I mean, every report begins on the above date and time while driving cruiser 973, but you just learn to blow past all of that, right? And get at the part where the officer writes, "I spoke to the victim and asked what happened, and the victim said," and boom, there's your actual story. And it might only be 3 or 4 sentences. So you learn how to do that fairly quickly. You learn which ones you can sort of put aside, and which ones you need to spend more attention on. And I think that the payoff in time that you get from the process is more than worth the time that you invest in it. People don't think about that enough. But having done all that coding every day, yeah, maybe it took half my day. Uh, but when the chief came in and said, "I need a report of this," I could say, "Don't leave. I'll just print it out right now." I didn't actually say that, of course, because you always want to estimate 6 times what it's really going to take to do that type of thing. But I could have said that, and because I had the data all right there, it was all coded. It was rare that he asked me a question or anybody asked me a question that I didn't have the data prepared to answer. And so all that administrative report time uh, is time that you gain back.
And Chris,
For,
you can also use interns for, say, some of
yep,
it. Let's just,
sure, yeah,
maybe not the most important things. You do want to be reading the crime reports yourself, but some of the putting the data entry into your own system, whatever you invent, whatever is possible in your jurisdiction. Chris, I
right.
wanted to ask you something I didn't mention was we prepared for this is, what do you think of the systems that are supposed to be like, they're the crime analysis software you buy, and that people might think that there's a way to buy an IT solution, a software that will do the work for you. Or like they might get an RMS that says, "Oh, we have a crime analysis component." I mean, I don't know about that, but since I had nothing, but myself in the beginning. I didn't have any to deal with that, but I do know I see software that's supposed to do some help it make it a lot easier. What's your opinion on that? I mean, just because there are people who are going to watch this that are trying to figure out how to do better analysis, and they're new or they're starting.
Right.
They have some choices on what to buy or what to do for software.
Well, let me say it first. I have seen a few attempts to do the type of pattern identification that we're talking about with software. I've made a few myself, trying to build the right sort of formulas in a database that will help at least triage which cases you ought to look at, especially if you are a bit overwhelmed in time. And I think this you can't entirely rely on it, but there's some promising developments in that area. But almost all of them have been things that analysts have created. I haven't really seen a good commercial solution uh, that involves, technology in the process of identifying patterns in the first place. But just in general, when you talk about crime analysis software, my opinion is that almost all of it, despite its name, is not meant for crime analysts. It's meant for other people in the department to do crime analysis like things, such as make a simple map of robberies or do some simple charts or statistics without having to bother the analyst. And if analysts get some use out of those things, I'm not going to gainsay that if it makes the job quicker or faster. But I'm very much a foundationist. I think analysts need to become masters of manipulating data with as sort of a minimal um, interference from other applications as possible. All right, so I don't mean they should be ticking things off with a pen or making maps by putting dots on a paper map. I wouldn't go that far, but you need to know how to use a proper GIS before you start to rely on special crime mapping systems, because there's almost always going to be a place that you need to do something that special customized system just can't do. And if you don't know how to use the underlying software, then you're just out of luck. And I would say the same thing with database and software and statistics. You need to know how to query data at the most raw level using SQL statements, using common database management tools before you start to rely on anything that creates the charts and maps and statistics for you. Because again, you're going to run to a wall where they just don't do the thing that you want them to do. And you're going to have a complex question that you need to ask, and you need to be able to learn how to use those tools. So they don't excite me. I apologize to anybody out there working in this field who's trying really hard to develop software of use to crime analysts, but I want Microsoft Office and a GIS system, and that's it as a crime analyst. And I'll make my own automated processes for working with that data.
Well, plus, Chris, we didn't talk about this either, but you want to, as a crime analyst, add things you find that aren't in the database. Let's say you talk to an investigator, or you have pawn shop data, something relevant, pawn shop data, or even, I was looking at my notes of the system I developed, but I might want a map of all the restaurants in Buffalo, because, or all the churches, and because I want to see, I just want to know some things about possible targets when I'm looking at patterns or understanding a crime problem. And we didn't talk either too much about how we can use this also in like a problem-oriented policing or evidence-based policing, they call it now more. But we're using the information we have that's qualitative to help inform how do we solve this problem. And it isn't just about numbers. Mapping, like I mapped myself, and I figured out different things I could understand through mapping. But a cluster of robberies doesn't mean that's all the same people. So it's a pattern. Oh, there's a lot of robberies here at Grant and Ferry, which is, but that doesn't mean it's the same people. It means that it's a problem neighborhood in my city. So you need to do this work. There's no shortcuts, right?
Right. I mean, there are, but they just don't create very good outcomes, I suppose.
Right.
So, and the last thing I would say is just on the question of, whether you have time. Of course, big agencies with large crime analysis units nobody's expecting every analyst to read every report. It's more a case of dividing them among the analytical staff that you have. However, you naturally divide responsibilities. If you do it by crime, the robbery analyst should be reading all the robberies. And if you do it by geographic area, the District 3 analyst should be reading all the District 3 crime reports. And I really maintain that unless you are way, way, way understaffed analytically, you have time to do it. And it's a process worth doing.
Yep, it is really worth it. And as I said, it's a skill. If you don't have it, you'll develop it, because to me, it's also about curiosity, right? Which is one of the high priority qualities an analyst should have. I'm curious. I want to know what's happening. Yeah, it gets boring, but it's not that boring if you're looking to discover, So like I'm doing some genealogy work. So I'm discovering like, oh, my great grandmother didn't die in childbirth like everybody knew. Like I'm looking. It's not like it's a boring, but it's like tedious to look through records, but you find things, and that's really exciting.
Absolutely. Well, I think we covered everything, don't you?
Yeah, it sounds pretty
okay.
Cool.
Well, I've got our contact information up here if anybody wants to reach out to us. And I love talking about these issues. So to everybody watching, I hope this was of use to you, and I'd love to see you at an IACA conference or some other event sometime now that we can do that again.
Sounds good, Chris. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And I know for sure that some people will find this of value. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie.